everybody. How are y'all doing today? Yeah, are you ready for security? All right, IoT security, this is gonna be great. We have a great panel here for you. I am actually gonna let each of my panelists introduce themselves because I did not bring all of their information up and I'd hate to mess up their titles. So, that would be just rude. Quick introductions, you guys. So Chris, let's start with you.
How you doing? I'm Chris Rill. I'm one of the founders and CTO at a company called Canary, based in New York City, and we build home security products for the general consumer.
I'm Nicole Egan. I'm CEO of Darktrace, and we build cybersecurity for enterprise and operational technology.
Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, which focuses on how cybersecurity will change over the next 5 to 10 years, including implications for the Internet of Things.
Good morning. I'm Mark Bartolomeo, and I'm responsible for Verizon's IoT product management and product development.
And I am Stacey Higginbotham. I run a podcast called the Internet of Things Podcast, and I am a human guinea pig for the Internet of Things. So it's terrifying. I've had my house hacked on purpose by people, and I live in basically a lab environment, and my family hates me. So to get this party started, you guys may be aware that a couple weeks ago, the Internet of Things had its biggest security scare with the Mirai botnet. We had massive DDoS attacks, and everybody was like, oh my God, the Internet of Things, it's broken, it's insecure, freak out. But most of these devices were actually, I would say, older network DVRs, not as exciting. So I want to start with the idea that I think is utterly new for connecting everything that we have to the Internet, which is that it won't ever be secure. So we've just answered the panel's question, no. So now what do we do? And you guys feel free to disagree with me if you think it can be secured. So who wants to go? Who's most excited? All right.
I'm going to go. So, we're talking about networking a lot of devices, and you mentioned that it'll never be secure. I think it's something that, we must secure. It's where my financial information is. It's where I do my banking. It's where I have my social networks. It's where all my healthcare information is. It's where our children, go and play. So it's a huge problem, but it's a problem worth solving. And I believe that with some of the advances that we've been looking at recently on setting standards for devices, that's a start. But it's going to take us looking at device security, network security, host and traditional IT security, but not just all infrastructure. It's also about employee training and employee education.
I want to disagree a little bit, which is rare on these panels to actually have slight disagreements, but I think that the Internet of Things is something that cannot fully be secure. This is something we developed scenarios for the future of cybersecurity, and in none of our 5 scenarios did we think that devices could be fully secure because we just have to assume that there is a risk that we will always have a small degree of failure. We should absolutely be working to get that down as low as possible. But if we set ourselves up to believe that perfect security is possible, we're never going to achieve that, and the public will respond as a result.
But I have to think, who are the threat actors you're trying to prevent these attacks from? So I think, in general, you can provide a very secure product, but you need to understand who you're trying to protect that against. If you're looking at government actors, or are you looking at script kiddies that were able to take over all of these DVR devices? And so when you look at who your threat models are protecting against, I think you can, for some of those models, protect the consumer from those threats. But when you look at government agencies and things like that, it's a really hard problem to solve.
When you look at IoT as well, there is no more perimeter, right? And so the whole kind of way we used to think about security, that you could put a firewall and there was a perimeter, well, those days are long gone. So I think the whole approach has to change. I do think, to your point on the level of threat actors, if you have a sophisticated threat actor, they will get in. There is almost no way to keep them out. So I think it's more about making sure you actually have visibility into these IoT devices. And I think if you go back to the attack you mentioned, most people didn't even know that some devices of theirs were part of the botnet.
They still don't know.
Yeah, so, Stacey, it's a problem we'll probably never stop working on because you could never do enough. You know, as the same way we secure our homes or secure any physical assets that we have, the more sophisticated we become, the more tempted, you know, people are, you know, really ready to challenge that security. And, you know, last year we looked at 100,000 different breaches that were registered on Verus. And of those 100,000 breaches, there were 66,000 that actually had complete information about who the actors were, what the time frames were, you know, what assets were targeted. And we looked at about 2,500 of those breaches last year that were actually confirmed where they stole data. And when you look at that, it really does begin to define sort of this broad area that we have to address for security, where it's everything from, you know, credit card skimming to working on private network security to looking at how even things like privileged access credentials are being misused. So I think there's a broad spectrum that needs to be addressed.
Okay, you're getting ahead of us here, but that's okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we've already convinced you that, oh, maybe security is not a total finite thing. Let's talk about a mental model for security, because back in the day you had like computers and people put antivirus on there and that was like done. And then you've got cloud computing and you're like, oh, let's reroute. It was network based, so DNS, that kind of thing. You've got. But for IoT, we've got devices, we've got communication between devices, and then we've got the cloud and gateways and blah, 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 blah. So what kind of mental model should we be thinking about, and what should we focus on if we're trying to secure these things?
So yeah, we came up with a mental model. We actually have two groups of people that came together when we formed Darktrace, and some of them were government intelligence community folks from places like GCHQ and MI5 in Britain. And the other group was experts in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we got these two groups together. The model they came up with was the idea of emulating the human immune system. So obviously we have skin, and that's necessary, and it's good that it keeps a lot of things out. But sometimes the really scary things can actually be inside our bodies. And so the way that the immune system works is it has an innate sense of self, and therefore if something not self gets in, it automatically detects it and fights against it. So that's the model that we came up with that we've translated now using machine learning to be able to defend the inside of networks.
And that's monitoring traffic, though. Is that actively searching out, using artificial intelligence to see attacks and prevent them?
So it's using the artificial intelligence to learn a sense of self. So it looks at 100% of the raw network traffic, and it understands behavior of every user and device specific in that network. And then it understands when something is out of the ordinary. It automatically detects the threat. And then the next phase we found was to automatically respond to the threat. Now that's kind of interesting because I kind of liken it to, I think, the first time you get into a self-driving or autonomous vehicle, because you see the security team kind of saying, okay, I'm glad you found the threat, but am I ready for true automatic response of even unknown threats? And so we actually run it right now where people can actually have it make a recommendation and then they can decide whether to take action. But in certain cases, like fast-paced attacks like ransomware, you have to use it because it's the only way to slow down the attack for humans to catch up.
All right.
For us, we tried to look at the positive side of IoT. I think right now, especially in this environment, everyone is thinking about the risks, and we think that there's a great opportunity as well. So the mental model that we used is what we called the intentional Internet of Things, and the idea is that as governments start to rebuild their infrastructure, they can use IoT to help achieve gains. Now, there are some deep risks in that. One risk that we highlight is micro attacks, where individuals can get to a number of different similar devices and make small changes that are almost imperceptible. So those can be deeply problematic, especially as governments become more integrated. But we don't want people to forget the positive side of the IoT and the great benefits that can come from it, even as we need to consider the security at the same time.
So I hear you guys both are actually talking about something that's probably a good place to start, which is awareness of what my network should be doing or what my devices should be doing and what's happening on it. So let's build up from there. Like, what is the role of, I don't know, encryption or policies? I mean, it feels like we already have a lot of policies in place. So what's different, or can we just throw them at the Internet of Things?
Well, I think the difference here is that there are some companies that care about security, and then there are some companies that treat security like another feature, and they might put it on their backlog when they're developing a product. So I think especially for consumer companies, we've seen over the last couple of years a lot of innovation in Internet of Things, but we haven't seen a lot of consumer demand for security in those products. When consumers go to the stores, they're not asking the representative for the most secure camera product. They're looking for battery power, or they're looking for some type of sensor. And I think with the botnet and other types of vulnerabilities that are being kind of brought to public attention, I'm hopeful that the things that we're doing at Canary are going to drive customer demand. We take security very, very seriously, and it's something that we did because we care about it and we believe it's important, not because the consumer is asking for it. So I'm building Canary, we're building Canary for ourselves. We're making these products secure and trusted, and I'm not necessarily sure everyone in the industry shares that same concern.
How many of you guys have purchased a connected device? Hands? How many of you guys looked for a security feature or kind of thought about security when buying it? Okay. How many of you would have paid, what, $30 extra? Okay, hey,
Yeah.
so y'all.
How many people change the factory set password on the device? Yeah,
This is a biased sample as the academic on the panel.
That's one of the biggest challenges, and I think that talking about devices and the focus that Chris and Canary put on it, basically almost anyone can have a device manufactured that goes onto the internet without a security standard or without any accountability or responsibility for that device. And I think that the area that Chris is focusing on is a start, and it does help the consumer.
And so one thing that our center is thinking a lot about and advocating for is a public awareness campaign. So if you think about previous instances where there's sort of an incentives problem where the consumer isn't taking these matters into their own hands, I think of seatbelts or smoking as examples. Governments and companies got together to put together a strong public awareness campaign, from television ads to, requirements to talking about regulations, et cetera. But it came from those parties getting together and thinking about these questions. And we think we need the seatbelts or smoking equivalent for cybersecurity, because the average consumer, and this is not the group of average consumers, does not understand the risk that they're currently facing.
Now, how can we convey, because security is a complex thing, so how can we convey that? What do you guys think might be the best way to convey that to the consumer? I had people tell me like a 5-star crash test safety rating, or like the LEED Energy Star nutrition labels or kind of things. So what do you think that should look like, and then what should be in it?
So one of the things that we found is that in working with media, right? A lot of people hear about the cyber attacks through the media. So I was meeting with someone at CNN, and they said their biggest challenge is there's no way to visualize it. If there's an airplane crash, there's a visualization of what may have happened, and at least we can kind of follow it, even though we're not aeronautic engineers. So one of the things that we did was we actually have a very visual way. It almost acts like a playback feature, where you can watch the attack play out, and it helps people who may not be that technical at least follow along. Okay, they came in this way, and it moved laterally through the network, and it did this, and this much data started leaving. It's like at least you can see it. And we found that whether that be for boards of directors, executives, or consumers, being able to visually follow it and see it instead of hearing about IP addresses and tech geek speak really helped a lot.
I really like the LEED standards, or the one that I would use is actually Energy Star. When you go to buy a refrigerator, whether it is energy efficient based on a label that is on the fridge. Now, you still need the consumer to want to care about that, which is another step, but at least the information is there. So having similar labels of minimum security standards, and you get the Cyber Star that's a horrible name, but you can imagine that could have real implications for at least allowing people to choose between devices. We still have to convince them why they care about that, but that's half of the problem would be solved.
And we do it today. So.
I was like, I don't think there are stars in your rating. It's like the ICSC.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing. People are aware of things like UL ratings, and we probably wouldn't plug something into our house that wasn't UL rated. And we look at things like CSA, and then ICSA just launched a 6-point IoT security certification framework, and it looks at the 6 most common areas where devices have been breached. And Chris's company just went through that whole process. And it's an independent lab, so what they do is they set up testing and they validate that the device is able to send alerts if it's trying to be physically tampered with. So if you try to open it up, it'll set alerts. That the device supports cryptography, so it's supporting things like FIPS and NIST. It support alerts and logging. It's supporting administrative functions. So a lot of the things I believe that we see in our enterprise work environment, we now may begin to see certified within some of the consumer devices. And it's a start, but security, and the way we try to describe it a lot of times is, it's a crime of opportunity. So the same way that you may leave your car unlocked in a dark spot in a parking garage, there's an opportunity there for someone to do harm versus keeping it locked and parking it under a light. You're going to be more secure. So I think the idea is just to continue to try to be more and more secure and stay out in front of it where possible.
When ICSA put out the ask to the community, hey, we have this program, we're soliciting feedback from companies, we were one of the first to say we'd love to participate in this program. And I'm proud that our company was able to pass the first time, which is very uncommon that I became aware of in the industry, where 96% of companies that go through ICSA's lab for testing fail the first time. And they often put up a fight as to why some of these failures that ICSA has found are important. And I think as an industry that more and more companies need to be proactive about this and go to these standards bodies and tell them that these are the types of things that we're doing, and I would encourage you to put these standards in practice so that everyone can benefit from these policies or these actions from companies that care.
And I just said we do need to make sure that people communicate those ideas out. So I wouldn't say that the titles are particularly catchy yet, such that the average consumer will understand that. And I think there are ways that simple marketing changes can make a big difference in the consumer space.
And I just want to go, because there are 6 main points. So there's logging of issues. There's, what else?
Authentication.
Authentication.
Cryptography.
Cryptography, so encryption. Anyone? Physical access.
So the ability to know if the device was tampered with.
Okay.
Yep.
Policy, is there a policy control maybe?
Yeah, there's policy control, authentication.
Okay. And then, was there one more?
There's the hosting.
Which is making sure it's not...
having the security certificate to authenticate that it's a valid device.
Got it. It's not something I'm hosting in a server in my garage.
Yeah, and if you look at all the elements you just named, a lot of the better devices we probably manage personally, in our homes do that. So if you change administrative rights, we probably receive an email or some type of alert to our personal email saying, hey, this device was, access was changed. Or if the device somehow was tampered with or disabled, you probably receive some type of log. And, putting that as a standard across all devices is a good start.
Okay, and you use this analogy of a parked car to talk about security, and I think it's a good one because you kind of implied, hey, it's in the garage, it's unlocked, it's dark. I would say even if your car is locked in a well-lit space, if you leave, like in San Francisco, if you leave a laptop bag in your car, I mean, it doesn't matter what's going to happen, it's going to get broken into. And I feel like with a lot of these devices, people know there's a laptop computer in there and they want access to it. So does this put a greater burden on the industry, or does it put a greater burden on the consumer? Like, who should be kind of worried most about this, and how do we transfer that kind of responsibility?
I think it's both, and it's similar to the comment you started out with about the bot attack. If you look at that, that was similar. These bots were basically knocking on the door of all of these devices to see if they had the factory set password, like XC355 was the password. And so any device that was still using that particular password, they were able to execute that denial of service attack. So, similarly, they were checking the front door, and if that front door was locked, they would just move to the next door.
And the valuable thing there was actually just computing power, which is great. It was bandwidth.
Right, yeah.
But that front door shouldn't have even been on the internet, right? So those, I mean, it shouldn't have been. A lot of these products have existed for a number of years, and the manufacturers think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we put connectivity into this product? And so what ends up happening is you take a system that was designed before the internet and you apply the internet to it. And if you don't actually do that thoughtfully, you get things like Mirai. And so if the manufacturers of these products just thought, well, does this service, and the service we're talking about here is Telnet, it's basically something that's used in manufacturing for debugging, that was available on the internet. And so anyone who was searching for that device could then knock on that door and get in and then do whatever it is that they wanted to do. So, you know, one of the things that we do at Canary is we just don't open up any ports. You can't knock on Canary's door as a device. And that just kind of removes a lot of vulnerabilities that, or potential vulnerabilities that are out there. So there's a lot of things that we can do as an industry that are just best practice that we should be doing.
And I'd just add to that, that problem is going to get worse because more and more companies feel like to be competitive in their market, they need to show connectivity. And these are companies that do not necessarily have a history of working with connected devices. So to the extent that even a public awareness campaign within the corporate community can help engage with, you know, startups, et cetera, to understand what the security protocols should be, that would make a huge difference. And I do think that's one space where, you know, companies that are doing well in this space can show leadership to others.
Well, and I think while manufacturers obviously should get the product certified and build security in, you know, to your point, there's a lot of legacy things that do connect to the internet out there. We had another one that actually used Telnet as well that we just caught, where it just broke into video conferencing equipment inside a corporate boardroom. And it recorded everything, both audio track and video, for 2 weeks and started exfiltrating that information out. And every video conferencing system out there is probably vulnerable to this. But the good news is, if you can watch that device and say, this device usually doesn't start moving traffic around our network and eventually exporting it out, you can catch it early and stop it from happening. So I think even with these older devices that have, you know, antiquated operating systems, and again, we don't only see it in the consumer space, we see it in nuclear power plants with SCADA equipment, right? So you see it in water supply plants. So across the board, you know, what we found is when there's not security built in, if you can actually still watch the network traffic, you can detect these anomalous behaviors early enough and actually stop them from doing real harm.
Now,
It's a great opportunity for AI you were talking about earlier because all of these devices generally have a consistent communication pattern, and AI can alert you immediately to the irregularities, and then you can take action.
Yeah, and it's you know, it can be user behavior, but it's also machine to machine.
Yeah.
And machine to machine is actually easier for AI to catch because it's very sensitive. So you can actually tune the mathematical algorithms to a very high level of sensitivity. So that works even for things like medical devices. An MRI machine should only communicate this type of data with this amount of data, this frequency, to this other server. If it does anything else, you want to know immediately.
Right.
now, what about people getting more sophisticated and bringing their own kind of AI-powered hacks in? They're not botnets necessarily, but starting to kind of the counterattack, and we've got a battle of the bots happening.
So it is starting to become mathematicians against mathematicians, you know, algorithm against algorithm, machine against machine. And so that is really the next level where it's going. You know, we're used to fighting, you know, human hackers with human threat analysts, right? And those days are rapidly changing. So we actually saw an attack about 4 months ago. We think it was one of the first attacks. We haven't been able to find another one or have anyone else find one. And it actually was an artificial intelligence attack. And so the attack, you know, got into the network, and it started looking around the network, and it started watching what other users were doing, and it tried to blend in as if it was a human, as if it was a standard user. And the problem with those is if you don't catch them right away before they blend into the background of these noisy networks, you're probably never going to find it. So we actually do, you know, envision a world where nation states start tapping into mathematicians and AI experts out of university to potentially attack other, you know, corporations and other nations. So it is rapidly becoming an arms race of AI against AI.
For the record, we're on the good side on that side.
Well, DARPA had a program this summer called the DARPA Grand Challenge, which asked teams to compete in Capture the Flag competition, which was AI versus AI. And so it was both offensive and defensive cyber warfare, if you will. And that program took place over 11 hours. And the things that the AI was able to accomplish go far beyond anything that any human has ever been able to do, both offensively or defensively. And so this is 2016. So I think that, go out 10 years from now, I think that these algorithms are going to be able to protect us from ourselves and protect us from these other, perhaps close to sentient algorithms that are trying to potentially cause us some harm.
And that's when they're going to start sending people with USB sticks back into the network, right?
Sneakernet, perhaps, yes.
Well, let's kind of switch a little bit and talk about what the government's role is in this, because we talked about a lack of economic incentive on the consumer side. There's plenty of incentive on the corporate side, but those, a lot of times you don't even know, like we don't hear about them and manufacturers hear about them. But is there a role that the government or any sort of agency should play trying to enforce standards, maybe establish a bare minimum? Maybe it's class action suits, which would be lawyers. I don't know.
I think it's around what we would refer to as responsible regulatory approach. And if I look at in the privacy area, it's been a big element for Edith Rodriguez at the Federal Trade Commission to really address privacy and get people to understand what they're opting in for and things like informed consent. And then on the security side, I think the entire ecosystem has been providing input to the Department of Commerce on what they would like to see and what role they'd like government to play. So we'll probably begin to see some recommendations. And when we get these recommendations, I think it motivates us all to really come together and solve these problems.
So UC Berkeley was honored to host the White House Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity, and their report is due out sometime before the transition to the next administration.
On what it's going to say?
Pardon?
Any hints on what it's going to say?
I do not have any hints on what that's going to say, but what I do know is that they're obviously very interested in these questions, and they are based, their staff support is based at the Department of Commerce with NIST, and NIST, of course, has come out with their cyber strategies. So I think one area that we think really needs to get more focus, and it's a research priority for our center, is new regulatory regimes. So right now, within the U.S. government, there is so much balkanization of different pieces of cybersecurity, and the agencies are not very good at talking to each other now. And in a brand new administration, you're going to probably see even increased problems because a lot of the top spots will be empty for some time. So this is a space in which we really need to get all the right players in the room. I hope that the White House Commission will help at least start convening some of those conversations, but there really needs to be an interest from the corporate perspective in getting those conversations on the ground. And then for organizations like us, we need to provide the neutral platform where everyone can come to the table together to speak sort of offline about what they actually want to see.
Do we need a new agency for this, or do we have, I mean, if it's balkanized, should we create a new place? I kind of don't really want that, but where should this live? We've thought a lot about different structures. One thing that I would say is that probably the person in charge of cybersecurity at the White House should be elevated above where they are today. So right now, that person reports within the counterterrorism infrastructure, and that's actually only a tiny piece of really what cybersecurity should do. The broader reorganization question of government is a very tough one, and because there is more and more money going into this space, it will be very hard to get people who have pieces of the pie to give them up. So I do think a broader conversation about institutional structure needs to happen, but I also think we need to recognize that there will be entrenched interests, and so it's going to take a while, even if we had the perfect solution, to be able to get that on board.
I think it's an area also where the EU, is able to have a big impact. And you were talking, Stacey, earlier about looking for examples of this. If you think about, before the FBI, criminals had figured out that they could rob banks and then cross state lines and not be pursued by the police. And so the U.S. government started the FBI, which is able to go after, the crime or the criminal that committed a crime in a different state. And I think we're at that same area today where the people who are committing these breaches and who are creating these crimes are who knows where. And so who actually is going to go after them? Now, I think we've seen the FBI, participate heavily, and Homeland Security participate heavily, but we're going to have to do more.
Well, and also a lot of the devices are not manufactured in the United States.
Yeah.
So I just came back from Japan and Korea. I've done several trips to Asia, and actually the Department of Commerce I went with on several of these trips because it's sometimes the actually attack can be embedded in the manufactured system before it arrives. Recently, we actually were looking at security at a sporting event, and they were using some facial recognition software for security purposes and even biometric systems. And it turned out that we actually saw beaconing to China from the system because it was pre-installed on it. So we have to remember that a lot of this can actually happen somewhere in the supply chain, as the devices come from outside. So it's definitely not a U.S.-centric controlled issue by our government. It does mean you have to reach out all the way to the manufacturer and the supply chain.
But the manufacturers have a responsibility to understand that supply chain.
So how do you make the manufacturer, like you guys probably would.
So we manufacture our product in China, and we brought our own manufacturing system to our factory. And it was not necessarily because of security, but that's an aspect of that system. It was more about accountability of our product and quality. And so throughout the manufacturing process for our Canary devices, we are able to test each and every one of them for all of the 40+ criteria across the board of what makes that product good. And so we understand every single product that comes off the line and what goes into that product. And I know that some manufacturing arrangements don't always allow that sort of transparency or ability to go in and tell the manufacturer, here's how we're going to do business. But I get to your point, it is a challenge to understand the supply chain for a lot of these companies that don't necessarily have the willingness or desire to go that far deep into how their products are made.
Chris, what percentage of your, I guess, bill of materials is security for you guys? If you kind of think about breaking it up.
That's a tough question.
I
Because
know.
it goes so far beyond what's actually on the device, because it goes into our cloud infrastructure and our mobile application. I would say, percentage-wise, I would say about 10 to 20% of the resources go into security, and it's something that I think that we didn't consciously say we're going to spend 10 to 20% on security. It was, here are the things that we believe are the right things to do for the consumer and for the products that we build, so we're just going to do them. And some of them are quite extreme based on some feedback we've gotten on, they're like, well, why are you doing this? And so it was like, because it seemed really like a good idea. And so there are components on our future products, and so we're constantly evolving security or what it means to be secure, and looking to add more and more technology to the devices that we create or the applications that we make to just stay ahead of the folks that are trying to undermine that security.
And that kind of gets into the whole, it will never be secure, it's always evolving. We've mentioned the word cyber a whole lot. And I hate that word, I really do. But people love attaching it and thinking, oh, we've got this magical virtual cyber location, and then we've got our real world. And it really feels like they're melding. So let's talk about, can we maybe get rid of cyber and just call it security? Is that ever going to happen? I mean,
well, so our center, we, as I mentioned, wrote 5 scenarios for the future of cybersecurity in 2020, and our scenario about the Internet of Things actually predicts precisely that in 5 years we won't be talking about cybersecurity because our physical devices will be integrated into our technology such that it's all just one big security ecosystem. That being said, I do think that there are definitely challenges that differ in the ecosystem of the internet than exist in physical systems, and we need to be prepared to take those into account. I also think that there's a difference in the cybersecurity space, and I'll still use that term because our center still is, we're sticking with it for the time being at least. But we are really thinking about the space as one in which civilians engage in the same space as do people in the defense and military industries. And that's a unique occurrence in our history. For the most part, we've had physical lines to draw between those. And so there are going to be different security issues that occur as a result. So it may just be that what counts as security expands and we no longer need the cyber, but that raises a whole host of questions that we haven't even begun to grapple with.
Now, at Verizon, if I think about security, and you guys have a wide range of obviously network and infrastructure, but you also have a wide range of people who are working and act kind of as a frontline defense against real world, like phishing attacks or that kind of thing. So how do you guys think about this melding of security and cyber security?
I want to answer that, but there's been someone over here who's been trying to ask you a question
Oh, I'm
for
sorry.
about 5 minutes, so yeah.
Anthony Damari from Nautilus Labs. One of the interesting things that I don't think gets talked about enough, particularly, especially relating to, I'm sure, Verizon and Canary, is there's a hardware issue here too, right? There's a way that we route electrons within these devices, and when you can start to delve deep within them, while we can change software rapidly, there is incumbent hardware that is really the whole core here. And you can't just change that, which is part of the government issue. It's also part of why we have all these insecure systems right now. So how do you guys address, there's also a hardware conversation to be had on top of the cybersecurity, because at the core, it is what powers all of it. So I was curious, especially from Verizon and Canary's point of view, how do you begin to think about that?
I think it's mostly a software issue, because most of these products are actually powered by general purpose processors. And from a software perspective, these systems aren't really connecting through hardware, they're connecting through software and digital networks. And that's really where the focus has been. From a hardware tampering perspective, sure, that is definitely a threat to these devices, but the bigger threat is in the software and how quickly manufacturers or companies can respond to the digital threats that exist with these products and these networks.
Yeah. And, in our area, we really break it down into the hardware elements, the network elements, the hosting elements, and then people. And we try to break down what are the best practices in each of those areas, and how do we secure this on an end-to-end basis. And that's really where the challenge we see comes, because even if we secure the device completely, if that's even ever possible, there's still other areas that we have to address. For example, just employee training, things like phishing or misuse of privileged credentials. That's an employee, that's a human piece, and maybe sometimes the technology is easier and the people are more difficult, but we have to address both.
Oh, Mike for dude in back. No, he's coming.
Thank you. So I'm
Wait,
just
you have
curious.
to identify yourself. I'm sorry.
Sorry, my name is Peter Marks. I'm with General Electric, but I won't speak. I was the CTO for Citi, and we set up the first cyber intrusion center. But this conversation seems really interesting, but a little weirdly divorced from enforcement. We are talking about crimes, after all. And one of the things that I've noticed just as an individual, my data was taken through OPM. My data was taken through Target. My data was taken through United and UCLA Healthcare. And to the best of my knowledge, not a single person has ever been prosecuted. And I'm just kind of curious as to where enforcement fits into any of this, much less the business harm and everything else.
Yeah, so I've looked at some of the materials that James Comey at the FBI has released, and that's exactly the area that he's talking about going after. And I think it starts in one of the problems that you have is sort of the shaming that occurs for the people or the company that were breached. So it's sort of we're prosecuting or pushing against almost the victim, which is wrong. And if you go back, 4 years, only about 20% of the breaches were actually identified by the FBI, where now it's up, over 50%. And I think the third piece, Peter, is the area where we talked about the agency that needs to do the prosecution. How do you prosecute these companies that are all over in different parts of the world, and how do you gather all the forensics information to be able to have a successful prosecution? We're probably still a little bit too far away from being able to do that.
I will say that my meetings when we're setting up the cyber intrusion center, my meetings when we were setting up the Cyber Intrusion Center in LA, it was one of the most interesting things. I'd never been in a meeting with a bunch of people wearing firearms in my entire technology-based career. It was the first time, and it's sort of an odd feeling. It's even odder when you stop noticing.
Yeah.
But it seems very antiquated compared to the tools that are needed now, shall we say.
So I would agree with that for a couple of reasons. So first, the FBI is really making an effort now, especially after the Apple FBI debacle, whatever you can call it, to reach out to companies now. So they came to Berkeley a few weeks ago and hosted a closed-door event where we had conversations with a number of companies, especially general counsels. And the main message that came away from that is that the FBI wants to treat companies that are, subject to breaches as victims. And so they are trying to get more information sharing to occur. And so only time will tell whether that happens. As a result, though, that makes it more difficult to go through prosecutions, and I think the points that were made earlier are excellent in that jurisdictions don't seem to apply the same way in cyberspace as elsewhere. So most of the perpetrators are outside U.S. jurisdiction, and even if you put out a warrant for arrest, you're not going to get the opportunity to extradite that person in all likelihood, and even if so, collecting the forensics to actually have a successful prosecution is incredibly difficult. So another new regulatory regime, we almost need to rethink law enforcement in this space and engage internationally, because these are not domestic problems for the vast majority of cases, and unless we start thinking more broadly, we're really going to miss the boat on that one.
I think the other part is the forensics data. So if you do look at the Verizon report, the average length of the attack is quite long. We hear stats around 140 days, give or take. Well, what ends up happening is a lot of companies that might be using certain types of legacy approaches, such as log-based systems, those might only be around for 2 weeks at a time because there's so much data that they get replaced with the new logs. So one of the things that we've looked at is, how do you make sure that again, using things like machine learning, as a probability of early threat detection says that something's probably off baseline of normal, how do you make sure you keep all of the data around that so that if you do have an FBI investigation come in, you can actually hand them over all the information related exactly to that attack and have all the forensics data?
I will give you another little thing, and don't worry, your questions will happen. I was in Washington last week, and I was at a law firm speaking, and they had a class action lawyer who afterwards grilled me on all the various security, and this is consumer-oriented, but he was highly interested in kind of issues of responsibility, what's part of terms of service, what's a fiduciary duty, and I think those are still issues that they will pop up maybe next year, but it's going to happen. The other thing is the FTC actually fines companies or attempts to fine and censure companies for dumb data practices, like leaving all of your passwords in an unsecured database in the cloud, because why not?
On the class action point, though, arbitration clauses will make a big difference as to whether or not those can go forward.
That is true. So when you're buying your software, just click. But I actually think that's going to be a really interesting fight coming up, because there's a fiduciary duty and then there's your EULA, and where do those things? All right, question in the very back.
Yeah, so I have sort of a simplistic way of thinking about.
Oh wait, we don't know who you are. Sorry.
Early in the discussion, you talked about how...
You need to identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you. John Madison, Kaiser Permanente. Early in the discussion, you talked about the problem being feature set and time to market is what drives development. There isn't a big demand for security from consumers in general. And Mark mentioned that the real problem is end-to-end security. So in an enterprise, you've got a CISO and a network administrator that can do end-to-end security. But in the consumer-grade IoT, it seems like it would be not that difficult to describe a functional set of capabilities, not necessarily identifying specific technology or technology solutions, but a functional set that could create the star rating you talked about. And with a companion implementation guide that was at a average consumer literacy, so that they would know to change the default password that would be rated for that individual product. And then if those two things were really conspicuous to the consumer, I suspect it would cost a lot less than $30 to provide that kind of service and to know what you were getting, and at the same time be relatively technology agnostic so that you didn't impede innovation in that space by over-specifying a solution set for a particular functional specificity. So my question is there any thought of having a perpetual process that updates the functional specs and certifies that could operate in somewhat of a permissionless way so that the slow cycle time of regulation is not always lagging way behind the cycle time of innovation?
So, John, that's what Chris was referring to earlier, and I was referring to a little bit, was the ICSA Labs certification. And what they've done is they've put forward 6 criteria that they test for, and each of these 6 categories has a rigorous definition of what's required to pass that particular category. And one of those elements is the ability to do, remote updates and firmware over-the-air types of updates. And so I think that's a start, and that's something where I think you and I, all of us as consumers, will start to demand that the devices we buy have some level of, framework certification, or we just won't buy those devices. And I think it's the power of the consumer. Now, I think there's challenges because there's so many devices that are that have almost no intelligence at all and may not be able to pass that type of testing. And so it still needs to be looked at as we even look at even more unsophisticated devices as they come onto the network.
But the other part, in addition to the manufacturer, again, and I don't know if this is where your question was going, but I think as consumers, we basically do have networks in our houses of all these different devices all connecting over, Wi-Fi. So if you look at directions of things like home hubs, maybe you want to know if your router's been broke into, or if something is going on. I saw our gas company put a smart meter on the side of my house. I want to know what's going on with that smart meter. What if someone uses that to attack other devices in my house? So, I guess the question will be if you could make it simple enough so that, an alert does come up, you get a little text alert on your phone, or can look at visually what's going on and if anything's been broken into or attacked in your network. We've even been approached by home security companies like ADT, right? And saying, hey, there must be a way to be able to take what you've been able to do in corporate networks and be able to do the same in a home hub. And so we have a prototype of that home hub security in place right now.
So the question I was really trying to get at is ICSA exists and is trying to do that, but the gap between what they produce and how purchasers make a decision is enormous. So I was thinking about how do you close that gap, either as setting a minimum threshold before you can take it to market, or making it very conspicuous in the purchase process.
So that's a marketing issue, it sounds like. Is that what you're saying?
Or regulatory. I mean,
so
yeah,
the regulatory isn't going to happen.
So I think that your industry, the healthcare industry, recently did something like that with serialization and said that, okay, we're not going to, we think there's some big issues here with devices, but how about let's start where we have processes in the background that are tracking the serial numbers of these devices so that in the event that we know we have a faulty medical device, we know exactly which devices were affected and where they were shipped and how do we get it back in the event of a recall. So there probably are some elements in the background there that could be implemented in the short term.
There are a few different initiatives that are going on in independent forms. ICSA is one of them. I Am the Calvary is another. So there are a lot of bodies that are trying to create standards and hoping that the manufacturers of these products are going to voluntarily go through these certification processes. And hopefully, consumer now will become more aware of these, I would say, these vulnerabilities. So they start to ask questions of the companies and the products that they're using. And I agree with you that regulation is definitely going to be slow here. And so we have to, as an industry, step up ahead of that regulation and do what's right, because eventually if we don't kind of clean up this industry, they're going to do it for us and do it in a way that's a bit more heavy-handed than I think that will be needed.
Was there a question? Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question which is related to the role of government.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm Mari Pangestu. I'm from Indonesia, previously in government, but now chairman of a bank, which is into fintech and microfinance. I wanted to ask a question which is sort of related to the issue raised in the previous session. How do you balance between freedom of data flows and security? As mentioned earlier, Europe and like Indonesia and other countries in the world, they require localization of server. And the reason given is security. And then within that issue is also the slowness of the innovation cycle compared to what regulators understand to be the case. Like cloud, banks are not allowed to store their confidential information on the cloud at the moment in Indonesia, whereas we know that maybe it's still possible. So I just wanted to know what your insights are on how to balance this need for security on the one hand and the requirements that governments are actually implementing in some parts of the world.
I think you make an excellent point, and what the twist I would put on it is that it's different in different places. So the United States has a very different balance between privacy and security among how the consumers are willing to accept it than occurs in Europe. So last year we held a conference in France and sort of sat down with French innovators and asked them what they were thinking in this space. And really they are talking about digital sovereignty and maintaining control over the data that they have and the protections that are available in Europe that might not be available here. So it's actually for them a deep and core issue that hasn't necessarily been expressed that way in the United States. So I think domestic rules will continue to balkanize the space unless those sorts of conversations can begin to happen, and where ideas about innovation and trading can occur such that other places see the benefits of innovation in this space and want to cooperate more rather than just seeing it as a possible negative for their development.
Yeah, I think the participatory regulatory process, is important, and I think all of us spend a good deal of time, contributing to what those regulations may look at. Probably the best example that I can think of that illustrates the problem that you're concerned about, and I think everyone is the whole area of encryption and the strength of encryption. And the stronger that encryption becomes, or the more proprietary that becomes, the less ability or the weakened ability our federal agencies have to go after people and actually identify, who's on those types of networks. So those are some of the challenges.
All right, I want you guys to not sleep well tonight. So I'm going to ask each of you very quickly, give me kind of in the next 5 years, how do you think attacks are going to evolve against the Internet of Things? What should we be worried about? We'll start with you, Chris.
Oh boy. I think for the next couple of years, it's going to get worse before it gets better. With the innovation cycles that happen in hardware, the things that are coming out this season were in development, 2-3 years in the making. So I think that over the next couple of years, we're going to see probably more of the same, sadly, because a lot of these things don't necessarily have firmware upgradable, over-the-air updates. So I think for the next couple of years, the things to be scared about are likely the new products coming out, both from big organizations and also from startups. And so I would say ask a lot of questions before you buy these products.
I think that we, first saw a lot of types of data theft, like credit card information being stolen, websites being defaced. We then went into a phase that we're still in right now of trust attacks, where, obviously the DNC hack was a great example, but where, attacks that basically try to get society to lose trust in democracy or in our financial markets. And then I think the next evolution, as I said, will be this, machine fights machine, AI-based attacks.
I'll add 2 things to the table. One, micro attacks, so small attacks against a large number of devices. If you have millions of smart refrigerators with your payment methods, you only need to change those payment methods by even $1 to make a large amount of money very quickly. And then second, I think a spin on the artificial intelligence question, which is you will not be able to tell whether an attack